We begin tonight with something that you can see right here that you never really saw in the 22 months throughout the investigation. Bob Mueller, in person, doing what usually fell to his Justice Department detailed spokesperson, Peter Carr, many, many times, which is refused to answer press questions. And many people might want Bob Mueller to be able to enjoy Easter Sunday like anyone else, but as a still serving public official, this was what happened today when he left Easter services in Washington.
Sir, could I ask you a couple of questions? Will you testify before Congress, sir?
No comment.
Are you sure about that, sir?
Sure.
If he were anybody but the president, would Mr. Trump be indicted, sir?
Now that you finished the,
sir, why didn't you make a recommendation to Congress one way or the other, sir?
Are you going on vacation at least somewhere?
Did the Attorney General accurately characterize your positions on conspiracy and obstruction, sir?
Bob Mueller jumping into the car and metaphorically and literally doing what he's done at so many points in this probe, which is err on the side of not speaking in any way other than through his report. That report, of course, we have at least in a redacted version now, and Democrats are demanding that Mueller go beyond what you just saw with the press and in a more formal fashion testify and address any remaining questions. Judiciary Chair Jerry Nadler says do it by May 23rd. The other issue, though, confronting Democrats is what they'll do with the redacted report or the full thing when they get it, because it has very clearly evidence against Donald Trump for the crime of obstruction. Will they use it to begin at least impeachment proceedings, if not impeachment? Will they do any other methods of accountability, or will they just move on? What we're seeing today is that even though the top chairs there of the investigating committees are not yet able to agree at this hour on exactly what they want to do next.
Do you think this is impeachable?
Yeah, I do. If proven, which hasn't been proven yet, some of this if proven, some of this would be impeachable, yes.
I'm not there yet, but I can foresee that possibly coming.
I, for one, have been for impeachment for a long time. I'm going to continue to be for impeachment.
I think what we are going to have to decide as a caucus is what is the best thing for the country. The obstruction of justice in particular in this case is far worse than anything that Richard Nixon did.
Worse than Nixon, and Democrats very clear on what that means and how that presidency ended. Now, tomorrow, we're told Speaker Pelosi will actually be convening Democratic members on a call to suss out these differences and figure out the way forward. Let's get right into it. As I mentioned, I have some special guests tonight. Neil Katyal, former Solicitor General of the United States. He wrote the rules governing Mueller, which speak to some of the decisions and hard calls that were made. He's an MSNBC analyst. Jason Johnson, a politics editor for The Root. Eleanor Clift, Washington correspondent for The Daily Beast. And Natasha Bertrand, national security correspondent for Politico. A good evening and a special thanks to all of you for being part of this coverage here on a Sunday night. It's interesting to do this special when we do know that Mr. Barr, from the beginning, wanted to issue his own judgment and not have a lot of other discussion, be it from the Congress or on a panel like this. It's clear he was trying to short-circuit the discussion. As journalists, although we don't know where this goes, we're not going to have it short-circuited. So I'm very thankful to have you all here. I could start with Neil as the legal heavyweight, but I'm actually going to start with Eleanor for the congressional view of this. Given that there's overwhelming evidence of obstruction in certain places, but there is no underlying conspiracy, what do you think is the standard for Congress to proceed on this, on substance, if not on the politics?
I think there's no question that this president attempted obstruction of justice. The fact that he failed at it because some of his people protected him does not excuse him from the steps that he took, in my view. So I think these are clearly impeachable crimes. But this is political war. We've got two sides. We've got the Barr, Rosie scenario, and then we've got the dispassionate facts as laid out in the Mueller memo. And I think that the Attorney General actually scored a political win for this president by putting the simplistic Rosie scenario out there first and early. If you talk to people who are not fully immersed in this, you know, they buy no collusion, no charges of obstruction of justice. Let's move on. I think it's up to the Democrats to keep this issue alive, to do appropriate oversight, to bring the characters out of the Mueller report onto cable television and let the American people hear these stories firsthand. we have this president's behavior as outlined in a number of tell-all books, now documented in excruciating detail by a federal prosecutor. The American people do need to hear that. But you can't conduct a war if you do not have public opinion with you. We couldn't sustain the effort in Vietnam, and we couldn't sustain it in Iraq after a certain point when you don't have the public. The public is not with impeachment. They don't fully grasp, I don't think, the dimensions of what this president has done, what he is capable of doing, and how he is not being held accountable. So there is an education job to be done. So you don't take impeachment off the table, but you don't launch into it. You conduct appropriate hearings, and you do other things. You take care of the people's business, and there's plenty of that, from immigration to opioid drugs to health care. And the Democrats should not allow themselves to be swallowed up by this report.
Neil?
So I agree with the idea that Barr had a short-term political victory. I just think it's short-term and ephemeral, and not something that's going to last. So Barr didn't say two things that were crucial. They're on pages 1 and 2 of the Mueller report in his lengthy press conference. Number one, Mueller says, even if Trump were guilty as sin, I couldn't indict him because of these two Justice Department opinions, and as such, I'm not going to potentially incriminate him in the report. So that's number one. And number two, he says, if the evidence shows that Trump committed no crimes and was clear as day, then I will exonerate him. And Mueller does neither. And then, as we'll be talking about over the next couple hours, Ari, the report paints a devastating picture of the president. And I've heard Eleanor and people like that say the public isn't behind this or something, but that's because I think of this Barr pre-spin press conference and his 4-page memo earlier. Now the public has this long report before it, and I think Mueller bet on the public. He bet on the faith of the public that they'll read this report, they'll look at it, they'll look through these devastating details about what the president has done. And the president has gotten away with a lot of stuff for the last 2 years, from Charlottesville to taxes to trade and lying and all that. This is of a totally different magnitude. Here you've got people, witnesses, including the president's staunch allies, like his White House counsel, Don McGahn, implicating the president in the commission of crimes. It's going to be much harder for him to dismiss, and I think there's only one course of action for the Congress to take ultimately, and it's going to be to impeach this president.
And that's a lot coming from you as a establishment legal voice. I mean, you're not saying that from the hinterlands or from the outside. You've served at the highest levels of a careful administration. I mean, Jason, to that point, go ahead, Neil.
I was just going to say, I mean, if, you know, the report and the devastating details in it are so strong that if you don't impeach and don't launch an investigation over this, I don't know what it's for at the end of the day. Nixon wasn't even close to what this report says.
Well, that's striking when you put it like that. Again, because, Jason, the way to read Mr. Barr's now exposed misleading statements, both to the Congress and to the public, is either that he's incredibly over-aggressive, almost sort of reckless in doing what he didn't need to do from a political perspective, but just wanting to spike the football, or what I think Neil Katyal just laid out. The alternative explanation is that on its face, the overwhelming evidence of obstruction in the report, that is to say part 2, is so damning and so bad and so fueled and supported by Donald Trump's own most loyal innermost aides that Barr felt a need to get ahead of it, even if he knew he was kind of pulling a grenade on himself that would explode soon, because it was so important to get ahead of those stories which are supported by Bannon, by Priebus, by McGahn. Jason.
Right. All right, look, Barr was going to jump on the grenade and supposedly take it so that the shrapnel wouldn't hit everybody else in the administration, but it didn't work. If you look at any and every single poll, the Mueller report has not, and this is where the political and the constitutional responsibilities really come into play. The Mueller report hasn't changed anybody's mind. There's nobody out there who was swayed or convinced one way or another by anything that Barr said.
I have to interject just to say, we can't even have that assessment for weeks. I don't think we can say on a 400-page report going into, as I've noted, Passover, Easter, and the rest, if what we mean is people's reactions to the smoke coming off the Mueller report, sure.
Right.
But I'm old-fashioned enough, I guess I wouldn't even have this job if I wasn't. I'm old-fashioned enough to think that the point is that over time, as people read, listen, and engage the content, that in 2 weeks, they might be informed more by the report and the facts and not the smoke around it, Jason.
Well, but Ari, I think when we're talking about, as sort of Eleanor mentioned before, the non-immersed public, because some of this is about sort of responding to public desire, public concerns, or the sort of politics of it, the non-involved public primarily feels the way they feel about President Donald Trump and whether or not he's a corrupt or irresponsible person, regardless. This is the point where it's up to Congress to make a determination as to whether or not what he did was bad enough. And here's where I think this is really important going forward with what we've learned, regardless of what Barr did, regardless of what Kellyanne Conway says, regardless of what Sarah Huckabee Sanders says. You know, if you looked at, say, Brett Kavanaugh last year, the public didn't have a strong opinion about whether or not Brett Kavanaugh should get on the Supreme Court. But after he had to testify and after people saw his behavior, the public sentiment began to change. The same thing is going to happen with impeachment. While the public may be somewhat ambivalent about this now or not really know what impeachment looks like, should the Democrats hold hearings and begin the impeachment process and lay out the case of what was actually presented in the Mueller report, I do think public sentiment will be in favor of this. And that's what I think is important going forward. If the Democrats avoid this opportunity, if they disabuse themselves of the responsibility they have to hold this president accountable, they will never have this opportunity again. And I don't think investigations are enough. I think impeachment is in order.
Natasha?
So there are a couple different ways to look at this, obviously. I think the political risk is very clear. The political calculation that the Democrats are making is very obvious. But that's also what they're criticizing the Republicans for, right? I mean, the Democrats have criticized the Republicans for acting politically. Their base voted them into office in November because they wanted to see them hold the president accountable. And what better moment than this is the argument that some are making. You have the Mueller report. It's kind of like the dog caught its tail and now it doesn't really know what to do. It's kind of like the Democrats really didn't have a plan for this because I guess they didn't foresee that the report would be this bad. But, you know, there's
also...
Let
me press you on that, Natasha, because is that where, in your own reporting journalistic way, you're raising an implicit criticism of some of the Democratic leadership, because they've known for 3 weeks there wasn't a conspiracy indictment. We knew that because Mueller finished. And they also knew that Mueller spent a lot of time to research the rest of what, at least in public view, looked bad and is even worse than the report. So why should it be so hard to have a plan for something that was expected?
Well, potentially because they didn't want to have a plan. Potentially because the argument and the thinking amongst some in leadership is we need to hold him accountable at the voting polls, at the polls in November of 2020, that the only way that the country is going to potentially, you know, come back together here is with a resounding defeat in 2020. And the argument also is that an impeachment process would politicize an oversight responsibility in a way that it doesn't necessarily have to be. So the other alternative that they're looking at is just holding oversight hearing after oversight hearing after oversight hearing about all of the things that Mueller found without necessarily calling it an impeachment proceeding. On the other side,
my come on is to them, not to you, but you as the reporter. Come on, endless hearings. I mean, this is a time for choosing, and this is where I want to press you and then Eleanor before I fit in a break, which is it not the Democratic Party that throughout the entire Trump era has been giving out lectures to their Republican colleagues and certainly to the senators in the Republican Party? When will you stand up? When will you go for what is right or what you've said in the past, not just politics? So isn't it politics if the Democrats are trying to game out 2020 instead of say, look, if there was obstruction, deal with it. And if there wasn't, then be honest about that. But either way, don't bring politics into something at this constitutional level. Natasha and then Eleanor.
Correct. No, and that's why I said at the beginning that, you know, the implicit criticism there is that they're being hypocritical, and that it's time for them to take an ethical position of the type that they've been hammering away on for the last, 2 years. But the other side of that, of course, is that the most important thing, the overriding concern, is about beating Donald Trump in 2020. But the Democrats also elected a wave of Democrats into office in November, partly because, if not largely because, they wanted to see them hold Trump accountable. But another aspect of this that I think we're going to see, just a little bit apart from this, is that the Justice Department and the Republicans in the Senate and the Republicans in the House are going to start making the origins of this investigation a huge issue, and so they're going to have to compete with the countering narratives constantly about the fact that this was the idea that this was a witch hunt. Bill Barr is conducting his own parallel investigation to the Inspector General into the origins of this probe. So there's going to be a lot of noise, and I think the Democrats now are trying to game out a way to rise above that noise in a way that doesn't necessarily have to seem political.
Eleanor.
Yes, this is not an either-or situation. I am going to defend Speaker Pelosi here. She calls it step by step. Yes, they start with oversight hearings. I don't think it's going to be oversight hearing after hearing after hearing. At some point, they will have to decide if they're going to open an impeachment inquiry. There is no reason to rush. The Pentagon Papers, when they came out during the Nixon administration, people read those papers, and that changed a lot of minds. Maybe people are going to read this book. The Washington Post says it's a runaway bestseller. And if people do read it, it will sink in. But people need help understanding the gravity of the situation, and the Democrats need to bring these people to life. And I can't wait to hear from the Sphinx, from Robert Mueller. Nobody even has heard his voice. Don McGahn is a witness who can testify to this president's behavior up close and personal. This is what the Democrats need to do. And they shouldn't be rushing into a trial in the Senate with Chief Justice John Roberts presiding over a Republican Senate that has shown no cracks, unless you count Mitt Romney's calling this appalling. So we may get there. I hope we do get there. But I don't think there's a rush. And for the Democrats to start feuding among themselves as to whether they're going to live up to their moral standards and launch impeachment right away because it's the right thing to do, or they're going to be craven politically because they're worrying about re-electing this person in 2020. I mean, I just don't think that's a set of arguments that Democrats need to be wasting a whole lot of time on.
Right. Hey, I'm Ari Melber from MSNBC. You can see more of our videos right here, or better yet, subscribe to our YouTube channel below. You could have been anywhere in the world, but you're here with us, and we appreciate that.